Hi, everyone. It's morning here in Arizona, so I'll say good morning. And I'd like to, first of all, say my name, which is Stephanie Forrest, and thank the organizers for inviting me to give this talk today. I decided to talk about a topic that I'm personally very interested in, that I think is super important, and that I think the GI field is well positioned to make contributions to helping us think about. And that is how engineering and evolution interact, and in particular, how they interact in software and why software is a great place to think about it. I should mention that I'm at Arizona State University, and I direct a center at the Biodesign Institute. I'm also a tenured professor in what is now called, or about to be called, the School of Computing and Augmented Intelligence. So let's get started. Let me give you, first of all, a quick overview of what I hope to cover. These are the main points. Some of them I'll spend more time on than others, but my big message is, first of all, that software is engineered and evolved. And to understand what that means, I think we need to think about what happens at the macro level, that is to our whole software infrastructure over time, and at the micro level, which is where most genetic improvement methods live. That is evolution in an individual program or module. I also want to say that genetic improvement, as it is practiced today, in my mind, is not leveraging all the power of evolutionary computation. And so I think I have a few ideas about what's missing. You may have others, but I think we should think about that. And also that evolutionary computation itself is still kind of a pale imitation of natural evolution. And so we may actually need to look to biology to get our GI systems running at the next level and tackling bigger, harder problems. And in the future, I think the future for engineering generally and software in particular is going to involve leveraging the interactions between evolution and engineering. And I think we in GI could maybe help everyone think about how to get there. So I want to start my remarks by reminding you of a paper that a famous French biologist, Francois Jacob, wrote, roughly 50 years ago, in which he argued that nature is a tinkerer and not an inventor. And in the paper, he talks about the tinkerer and the craftsman. I'm using engineering to kind of cover the craftsman idea. And anyway, he really highlighted the differences between, he laid out some properties of what I'll call engineering. I think none of them seem particularly controversial to us. And he contrasted them with properties of evolution. So for example, he argued that engineering or craftsmanship is a planned enterprise with specifications or blueprints, while evolution is unplanned and open-ended. He argued that I'm just going to use engineering because it's easier for me to say. Engineering is goal-driven and has objectives, whereas evolution isn't headed in any particular direction, but is just focused on survival and reproduction and relative fitness. He argued that because of this objective-driven aspect of engineering, that we could start with clean slate designs. I think that's probably less true now, certainly in software. And that evolution, on the other hand, was an ongoing process. It didn't get to go back and start at ground zero, but had to work with the elements that it had in front of it. And similarly, because of this clean slate design, he argued that craftsmen could make large conceptual jumps, whereas evolution had to be incremental because it's driven by random mutation rather than conducted by agents who have foresight and intent. And I think this actually summarizes how many people think today. but I have come to believe that Jacob is wrong, and that there is not such a sharp distinction between these two processes. And so I want to illustrate my points with some examples. First of all, I'm going to consider some examples that were clearly designed by evolution or by human ingenuity. And I want to observe that it's remarkable, to me it's remarkable, that such different design processes can produce relatively similar structures. And maybe you don't think this termite mound that was built by completely distributed agents and regulates its temperature inside the nest and controls humidity and even regulates gas concentrations. You might not think that that's exactly similar to this cathedral, but to me, they sort of have a similar shape, and our next example will be more like that. However, it's really not so remarkable because we, as human craftsmen, mimic nature all the time, as Gaudi did in this famous cathedral. Another example where we have two different design processes producing structures that are similar in function and in some cases similar looking is the lens. So we have the lens of an eagle's eye contrasted with the lens, a Nikon lens in a camera. And again, I think we got some of our ideas about building lenses and cameras from the fact that natural systems have vision. So there's lots of examples of that. I just picked out two. I now want to highlight some examples where evolution and engineering are sort of hybridized to produce new kinds of processes. And so my first example is one of my favorites. This is Frances Arnold, shown here in the picture, who won a Nobel Prize in 2018 for pioneering the field of directed evolution. And I was extremely excited when I found out she got the Nobel Prize, because directed evolution is basically a genetic algorithm implemented in chemistry. And so what they do is they start with naturally evolved individuals, pieces of DNA. They induce mutations. I mean, I think they up the mutation rate, but the mutations occur spontaneously. And then, so that's sort of the evolution natural part. Then they use an engineered screening system to do fitness evaluation in the form of chemical assays that test the individuals for whatever property they're trying to evolve for. In this case, high fluorescence. And then after the screening, they then use selection to amplify the most fit of the individuals according to their criterion, and then they repeat the cycle. So that I think is a beautiful example of sort of a hybrid between evolution and engineering. This is an example that probably almost certainly won't win a Nobel Prize because it is a major health problem, and that's the phenomenon of antibiotic resistance. And so here we've got the craftsmen who produce new drugs and release them into the wild when they're used to treat someone with a microbial infection. And if you treat enough people with the same antibiotic for long enough, eventually evolution finds a way to evolve microbes that can resist the drug. And we see a similar phenomenon in cancer treatment. And so then that leads to, of course, the need to engineer more drugs, et cetera, et cetera. And the problem here, this is highly simplified, but the problem here is that the left part of this cycle, the natural evolution part, seems to run a lot faster and cost less money than the right-hand part of the curve, which is the coming up with new drugs. A final example of these sort of hybrid engineered evolved systems are what are being called xenobots. And this is work that was published last year in the PNAS by Mike Levin's group at Tufts. And for those of you who don't know him, if you have any interest in sort of how biology and engineering and computation fit together, you should go look at some of the things he's done. I think he's a really, really interesting person who's done some very interesting projects. Anyway, this particular project, which he did with Josh Bongard and several others, took naturally evolved cells from the frog and used them to build a robot that could move towards a target, collect a payload, and then potentially move to another place to deliver the payload. And these are very small. These are like on the order of a millimeter. And I think the idea is that they might be used to develop medicine or to deliver drugs. So the payload would be some medicine. And what they did, I'm like way simplified flying, you should go read the paper, but roughly the green cells here, they designed the thing using a simulator that's shown in the middle, and the green cells are sort of passive cells, and the red cells are contracting cells. And they came up with a design that was roughly just those two kinds of functions that allowed the collective to behave in the way they wanted. Okay, so those are some hybrids, and I think our future is going to be more and more hybrids like that. There's plenty of other examples. But I also want to just highlight some ambiguities that I think really call into question this dichotomy between engineering and evolution. And if we use the criteria that Jacob pointed to, one thing that kind of violates that idea are Rich Lenski's experiments on bacteria. He's a well-known evolutionary biologist at Michigan State University, and he has studied in the lab populations of bacteria evolving over many years. It's several decades now. And in some cases, he's observed that these bacteria very suddenly switch from the ability to metabolize one kind of sugar to the ability to metabolize another kind of sugar. And it is truly a large jump, even though it requires a significant change in the metabolic processing of the cell. Another example of a large jump in evolution is the reassortment process in influenza. This is what can happen, for example, when a bird virus and a pig virus interact in the same animal and reassort and produce a new variant or strain, and those are lots of times the precipitating causes of flu epidemics. In a different vein, many people now view the process of innovation, so this is on the engineering side, as a process that looks a lot like evolution. And in particular, people now have measured quantitatively and argued less quantitatively that almost all technological progress is driven by recombination of earlier ideas. And so that, I think we all know this in software, but that really violates this idea of clean slate design as a key aspect of engineering. And then in software, as I will argue, I think we have lots of examples of how randomized systems, of how randomized kind of mutation-driven, undirected processes are being used actively as part of engineering. And so attack fuzzing is a great example. Chaos engineering is a great example. And I think people actively, people talk all the time about arms races and cybersecurity, and they really are like co-evolutionary arms races. Okay, and there's plenty of other examples, but all of this sort of leads me to ask the question: if I give you two two artifacts, and tell you nothing about them, how would you decide whether or not it had been produced by evolution or by engineering? And so this is sort of a twist on the famous Turing test. I'm going to call it the Jacob test. And it's really, to me at least, very unclear what criteria we should use. I mean, you can think about things like minimal design. I don't know what else. Maybe robustness you might put on the nature side. I'm not sure. And I think increasingly our engineered artifacts it's hard to point to what we think is really different. And so maybe in the discussion, if I keep moving on my slides, maybe we'll have time to get some of your ideas about that. But kind of to wrap up this part of the talk, I think nature is not always a tinkerer, but even more so, I think engineered artifacts are not produced only through craftsmanship. And it's really that second part of the message that I think is most relevant for us. So now what I want to do is talk about what that looks like in software. And so, excuse me, I think let me just check my time. I don't have a clock here. This is very annoying. Okay, I think I'm doing well. Okay, so most of us, I think, know very well that the key ingredients of Darwinian evolution are variation, competition and natural selection, and inheritance of variations. And some authors now argue drift as a fourth mechanism, but I think in the standard view, these are the three main driving mechanisms. And so we see all these things in software, right? Every time we copy a piece of code or a library or a package or even an entire executable, we are in some sense performing selection. And of course, the code is getting passed down, so it's being inherited, whatever the changes were in that particular version. And we have variation, which we get by people making small changes, and ideally someday by genetic improvement systems making small changes automatically, and recombining successful modules or functions or libraries, kind of mixing and matching as we go. And so my hypothesis is, and I'm sorry to say I've had this hypothesis for quite a while, some of you may have heard me talk about it before. My hypothesis is that software today is shaped by many generations of inadvertent evolution. And I would like to be able to confirm or deny that hypothesis, but I've found it harder and harder to do that, which is sort of what's led me to think about all these things. However, I will say that in the decades since we first started building these genetic improvement systems for software, I think software has only become more biological, and we have even more kind of driving mechanisms that are evolutionary in nature. And so we have things like Stack Overflow, which is kind of the canonical copy and inherit mechanism for little code snippets or genes. We have A/B testing that's used widely to design and experiment with web interfaces. And interestingly, many of these A/B systems are being run by genetic algorithms in the background. So the idea is that the genetic algorithm generates a randomized version of a web interface, and then we, the users of it, they collect data on how many clicks we make and how long it takes us to get to the Purchase Now button, for example. And then they take that information and use that to generate a new set of variations on the website. There's also the continuous integration paradigms in software development, which have become very popular. And I just want to give a shout out to the Repairinator project, which sort of try to insert GI into this DevOps cycle. I actually think that's a great, architecturally, a great way for GI to make its way into the world. And hopefully someday we'll have a little GI piece over here in the blue. But that's a much more continuous, incremental, evolutionary, make a random, make a test random or not, and a small change and see if it works approach to software development. And that's certainly different than the models that we used to have, which were much more write down the specification, write the thing from scratch, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, fuzzing we've talked about. The idea of engineers just making random inputs to code and using that instead of trying to figure out what they should be testing or how they should be thinking about their code. I think that's well accepted now. Chaos engineering is a thing, and it has a whole set of relatives. And that's essentially using these ideas of random changes on large distributed online systems to try to understand what their failure modes are and to make them more resilient. And then in the cybersecurity world, which I spent a lot of time thinking about, we definitely have these arms races. Two-factor authentication, I think, is a recent step in that arms race. And of course, as soon as two-factor authentication got rolled out widely, it didn't take long for there to be attacks against it, and Uber was an early victim of that. Okay, so these are all things that indicators to me that point to evolutionary forces in software. But what I think is harder to answer, and this is a little version, another version of this Jacob test, can we actually see measurable effects of this kind of macro level evolution in software? And in particular, what should we be looking for? What should we measure? What should we be looking for? And so this is a little bit of a story of the past few years of my life. Those kinds of questions led me to ask what it is that people in evolutionary biology look for as hallmarks of evolved systems. And I recently wrote a paper with Risto Mikulainen that asks this question with respect to evolutionary computation. And there we identified these, 6 or 7 different, I think we call them characteristics. Hallmarks might be a little overstating, but hallmarks, like what are the kinds of things you would expect to see in a naturally evolving system? And I don't have time to go through all of these or tell you how I think they do or do not fit in with software and genetic improvement, but I do have time. I'll tell you about 2 that I've looked at in my own work, which is neutrality and epistasis. So let me just tell you quickly about that. This is the relentless self-promotion part of the talk, where I tell you some of my own research. And so the first one is actually older work. You may have known about it. We've published it quite a while ago. Other people don't seem to be as much in love with it as I am, so I'm going to take the liberty of retelling it again. But it is known in biology that many mutations leave fitness unchanged. And there's a variety of different, in some cases, competing explanations for why that's true. But it is well known to be true, and most evolutionary biologists believe that this so-called mutational robustness is a key enabler of evolution. That is, we would not have systems that were evolvable if we didn't have this kind of mutational robustness property. So we, several years ago, set out to measure this in software and defined a neutral mutation There are now some other words in the literature that mean the same thing, but we will use the term neutral primarily. A neutral mutation is one that is test suite equivalent. That is, if you've got a test suite, you've got a program and you've got a test suite, and you make a mutation to the program, it still passes the original test suite. So we're going to call those mutations neutral, or if we're being really careful, neutral with respect to the test suite. In the context of bug repair, these neutral mutations might or might not repair the bug, but what we were interested in is just how much of this mutational robustness is there. And it turned out there's a lot, much more than I would have expected. I still find this really remarkable that even if we do the mutations only to regions of the code that are being tested by the test cases, still roughly a third of the time, the mutations we were working with at the time are neutral. And this work has been semi-independently was looked at in Java by the group that was in France and now in Sweden, and they got similar results. It took a while. I met with Benoit Baudry at one point, and it seemed like we had really different percentages. But when we worked through what we were actually measuring and how we were measuring it, it turned out that our numbers, our results were really very consistent. And this is just an example from a quick sort of like how you might get a neutral mutation. Okay, so that's known. I still think it's really interesting and important. And one thing that I think is interesting is the question of where it comes from. And so we've considered many answers, but I haven't figured out good ways to measure them or tease them apart. But there's one family of answers that is essentially sloppy programming. So it might be, I think lots of people think it's poor testing, poor test cases. I am quite convinced that's that might change the percentages a little bit, but that's not the driving thing. It could be software just has a lot of unnecessary redundancies in it that have just sort of crept in over time. There could be neglected shortcuts or optimizations, or this redundancy could have been put in there on purpose as a form of defensive programming. And there's probably some other explanations that fall into that category. It's also true, as in the case of that quicksort example that I gave you, that for any particular program specification, there are infinitely many programs that could implement it. So in some ways, it's not so surprising that there's lots of different programs that meet a specification. The fact that that you can get to those programs just by random mutation is to me a little more surprising. It could be that this is largely a psychological phenomenon, that the people who write programs are humans, and in order for them to comprehend what they're writing and understand it, or for other people to read it, that a lot of this redundancy is needed just sort of for the program to human part of the interface rather than the program to machine part of the interface. It could be an artifact of the programming languages we have. That's certainly possible, although we think the phenomenon cuts across the common programming languages. And of course, there's my favorite solution, my favorite explanation, which is it was produced by evolution. But this is why I have a hypothesis and I don't have like a confirmed hypothesis, because I don't know really how to distinguish this produced by evolution cause from all the earlier ones. Okay, so what we've been talking about with mutational robustness, if you look at this black dot here, and I hope you can see my cursor, what those experiments did was really, in concept, make, for example, 1,000 copies of a program and apply a single randomized mutation to each copy. And so in this graph, each node is a program, and two programs are connected by an edge if there's a neutral mutation that applied to one version of the program gives you another version. And so what we started doing, this was inspired by my many interactions with theoretical biologists over the years. What we did was we started with the original program, and instead of just going one edit away in mutation space, we started going, I think, as many as 10 edits away, and exploring what is often referred to as the neutral landscape. And so this is work that actually Joe Renzullo published a few years ago at a GI workshop, so it should look familiar to you. And in this example, the colored nodes represent inadvertent repairs to a latent bug. That is, a bug that wasn't being tested in the test suite. And the colors indicate different kinds of repairs, that is, repairs to different lines of code in the program. And this really, this result, I mean, we have these similar, I picked out this one because it was an echo of an earlier GI workshop paper, but just checking my time. Give me a minute here. Okay, I got to speed up. Anyway, this led us to really to think that if the repairs are often this far away in mutation space, that really what we should be doing is trying to look a little more broadly and get our search processes to move further away from the original program. And so now I'm going to speed up. That led us to ask where the repairs might be in neutral space. And it also led us to an insight which is totally obvious in retrospect, and maybe it's obvious to all of you, but I had not thought of it, that in fact, any mutation or set of mutations that is a repair to a bug must by definition be neutral. That is, it must by definition also pass the original test suite. And so what we did was generate a large pool of single edit neutral mutations, like 10,000 of them. And then we started pulling them out in random, sampling randomly, but in groups ranging from 1 up to 300. So over here, we were taking our pool of 10,000 neutral mutations and pulling out 300 of them randomly and applying them all to the same program, and then asking how many of those, I mean, we take the 300, but then we do that sampling of 300 multiple times, and we say, how many of those samples of 300 actually repair the bug? And what we found were these distinctive curves. We've confirmed this in many different programs now, where there is a peak that is a significant distance away from just one mutation at a time. And so we think that one way to improve automated repair is to get our algorithms looking around the peak, that is where there's more likely to be repairs in this large neutral space than so close to the original program. We think we understand why the curve is shaped this way, but what we don't understand is why for every program and bug scenario, the peak occurs at a different location and has a different height. So that's work in progress, but these results, if you're interested, were published recently at IPDPS. And the big news is that you do a lot better if you move quite a distance away from the original program. Okay, so that's the story about neutrality and why I think it's relevant. I'm just going to breeze through this quickly about epistasis. These are recent results that have not been published, but they are based on work that my student Jerry Liu presented at a GI workshop, I don't know, a year or two ago. I don't remember exactly when, maybe 2 years ago. We have recently, so this is his system, he calls it GIVO, and what we use it for is evolving the LLVM intermediate representation of programs that run on GPUs. And so this is just a little map of how that works. Recently, we've been looking at multiple sequence alignment programs and collaborating with a group from Lawrence Berkeley Labs They have a highly optimized, hand-tuned for a particular GPU version of the Smith-Waterman algorithm, which is used, is the most common approach to doing multiple sequence alignment. And this is a picture of the multiple sequence alignment problem, which I'm not going to take time to explain. Anyway, we did a run. They came to us with this and said, okay, hotshots, here's the best that we could do. Can your evolving system do any better? So we did a run, 256 individuals, 300 generations, and found a version of the program that runs 28.5% faster than the original, which is a huge improvement on an already optimized code that runs in the inner loop. And interestingly, that program has a lot of mutations. 17 of them are really the important ones. And of the 17, 12 of them are highly epistatic. And we're having a lot of struggles trying to understand how they work. I actually think the 12 break into some subgroups, but there's clearly a huge amount of epistasis in these solutions. And the whiz kid who did the hand tuning of the algorithm for the GPU, he's been working with us to help us understand what these mutations are actually doing. And some of them are things, for example, that the CUDA programming manual tells you not to do. There's all kinds of interesting things. But the algorithm, the program still gives the same correctness answers as the original. And so I'm really excited about this because I think this shows a lot of evolution, and also because I think it's a good place for genetic improvement, because these epistatic mutations, I think, are not only hard for us to understand, they're hard for humans to think up in the first place. And so this is a place where we can really, really make a difference. Okay, so let me just check my time again. Okay, I'm going to try to wrap up so we can have some discussion. This is the we've now left the relentless self-promotion part of the talk, and we're into the pontificating part of the talk. And so this is my summary of where we are today. Most of us are doing stochastic search of the space of possible program edits. And what I've observed in the papers that I see published and the ones that I review is that there's increasing emphasis on better mutation, more intelligent, templated, and targeted mutation operators. So the ways in which we change the code, I think we're putting a lot of effort into thinking about how we do that. But there's been, as far as I can see, very little attention paid to the search part of the equation. That's the way in which I think GI is not leveraging all of evolutionary computation, and recombination or crossover, and then drift, which is something I've been thinking about a lot every time I talk to an evolutionary biologist. We also, as I've mentioned, have these very conservative search strategies. So that's one reason I think we need to be thinking about search. There are some new ideas in the evolutionary computation community about that. Novelty search is an example. And then for program repair, of course, the vast majority of our repairs, with a few exceptions, are still single edits. So we're not really leveraging epistasis so much. These are my hopes for genetic improvement for tomorrow, for the future. The first would be using genetic improvement to solve more complex problems. And I think all of us would like to do that. I think that's why we're here and why we're working on the field. And to do that, I think requires incorporating more evolutionary computation, more of the real biology. I'm thinking much more deeply about neutrality and drift is my place to start, but there's lots of other untapped regions of the space out there. And then, importantly, I think we should be asking ourselves, what we would do if we had as many computational resources as the machine learning people have for training their models. And I would like us to think about how we could use those resources most effectively and how we would redesign our methods so that we could take advantage of them. And I'll just note that a huge amount of the recent success in machine learning has simply come from throwing just astronomical amounts of computing power at these training algorithms. And so I don't see why that shouldn't happen for evolution. But I think we should be thinking big and thinking about what changes that means for our field. And speaking of machine learning, is machine learning going to put us out of business? So there's a way in which, a program is just a mapping from inputs to outputs, and that's all a neural net is. So maybe all of programming and software engineering and high-level languages will just go away, and all we will ever have is neural nets. That's a possibility, and we're certainly seeing lots more machine learning in software engineering. But I actually think that that's not going to happen, and that we need evolution for a variety of reasons. And even the neural nets community, the deep learning community, has discovered using neuroevolution for designing these big deep learning architectures. And that's a form of modularity, right? That these big deep learning systems aren't just one undifferentiated gigantic matrix, but they're a whole series of little neural nets that are sort of wired together in different ways. And I think that's the kind of modularity that evolution is better at discovering than standard machine learning. And then, of course, I also would like us to really be thinking big about how evolutionary processes, whether inadvertent or intentional, like the genetic improvement, how those interact with engineering dynamics in software. I also think there's some evolutionary implications for software. And so I'm just going to mention three, I guess, quickly. One, and I'll spend the most time on this one because I think it's really interesting. Both Steve Frank and Mike Lynch, who are both eminent evolutionary thinkers, have talked about this, and it's a kind of ratchet, although that's a bit of an abusive terminology in the evolutionary biology world, so don't use it outside of this community. But the story goes like this: that evolution, from time to time, is good at increasing the robustness of a system, and it does that by discovering sort of meta control systems. So they might be repair mechanisms for detecting and repairing DNA errors. They might be homeostatic mechanisms. They might be the mechanisms inside a cell that help cells avoid becoming cancerous. But every time these robustness mechanisms are discovered, and there's a lot of them in biology, they come with a cost, right? It's a resource cost to maintain the mechanism. And importantly, they also reduce the selective pressure on the underlying components. So if you have a repair system, it's like typing, right? If you've got a spelling correction thing running in the background, automatically correcting your typing as you go, you become, as I have, a much sloppier typist. And so what happens after a while is that there's less selective pressure on those underlying components, and so they degrade, and that means that over time, you can't go back. You can't get rid of the robustness mechanism because the components underneath have lost their ability to maintain themselves. And so that puts in a form of directionality to evolution. And because of the cost of these robustness mechanisms over time, leads to an overall reduction of average fitness in some cases. And I think we have this in spades in IT systems today. And I would love to figure out the experiment where I could actually measure that. Okay, there's also a thing called highly optimized tolerance, which is sort of highlights the trade-off between optimizing for performance in certain dimensions and leaving yourself vulnerable to major catastrophes or perturbations in other dimensions. I think we've seen that recently with adversarial examples that showed up in machine learning systems that were overly optimized for a particular data set. And then as our programmed agents go out into the world, we're going to have interactions between the physical world and our engineered things, like I've shown here with this little helicopter, and real adaptive agents. And so I think these hybrids and these sort of unintended consequences like antibiotic resistance are going to become more prevalent. Okay, so I'm going to leave you with my questions, and I hope you as a community will help me answer them. How to distinguish between engineered and evolved systems? What are the effects of macro evolution in software? Like, can we actually establish that this is happening in some way that would be convincing? And just even a little closer to home, why is there so much mutational robustness in software? I think for genetic improvement, we need to think much more seriously about search spaces. I've talked about that. And then I think we as a field are really well positioned to develop and lead the way of thinking about best practices for combining evolution and engineering, first in software, but more generally for all of engineering. And so I will close with some quotations from another scientist who I admire greatly, Jack Szostak. He's at Harvard University, and he says, never do something that 1,000 other people are doing. So even though our field is relatively small compared to some of the other fields, I think that's a good thing. And I would like to encourage all of you to continue asking big questions. So thank you very much. I don't know what I'm supposed to do now that my talk is over. Do I stop?
What we're going to do now is people can ask questions in the chat and I'll read them out to you, and hopefully we can get a little bit of discussion going.
Okay, can I stop sharing?
Yes, you can stop sharing.
Okay. Great.
So,
well, I can see one person at least.
Yeah, you don't, and now people are giving you virtual claps. So, so yes, please ask questions in the chat, and I'll try to read them out to you, and we can discuss it. So Myra Cohen is asking, epistasis appears to be very powerful, but edits far away from the original program may conflict, making patches humanly readable and hence accepted by the community. It may also make validating the correctness difficult. We know we can have talent. We know we have the talent. Talent to hard to detect faults that even good test suites may not detect. This may mean we need to evolve stronger test suites along with larger edits. Can you discuss the trade-offs? That's a big.
Yeah. Okay. So. Sure. I think better, bigger, more test cases, as long as we can run them relatively efficiently or have a way of sampling them, is a good idea. I'm going to say the least controversial things first, and then I'll end up with the most provocative. Okay. And so the next least controversial thing is that we and quite a few others people are now starting to do work with using invariants, automatic invariant detection, to characterize candidate repairs and evaluate them. And I think that's actually quite promising in terms of being able to supplement our test cases. But I have to say, I don't worry about overfitting to test cases as much as everyone else does. And most controversially, I don't worry about readability, because no one is really, I mean, they're only now starting to ask questions about explainability of neural networks. And so I think, you know, in a way, I mean, I don't understand how my browser works. I think most of us don't. And so I think this idea of interpretability and readability is should not get in the way of us developing powerful evolutionary methods. But I do think there's some things we could do along the way to help it. And as I mentioned, I think evolution is better at finding modules and having definable units than subunits that would be more comprehensible than the way machine learning works today. But yeah, those are all fair points, Myra.
Okay, I'll go to Giovanni Gizzo's question. I got curious from incorporating more biology in GI. Is there anything that you personally would like to see from biology inside computation?
Well, the one that my personal first candidate is, I guess one thing I would say is this paper that we published in Nature Machine Intelligence sort of is my best crack at that. But it's by no means the last word. And out of those things that I listed on that slide, the hallmarks, I think thinking much more seriously about drift and much more seriously about selective pressure is kind of tops of my list. And I think part of why that's true is I think that might have impact on how we answer the question of what to do if we scale up in a big way. You know, when we get, I mean, I heard a great statistic not too long ago that the amount of energy it takes to train a single language model in machine learning is equivalent to the energy consumption, lifetime energy consumption of 5 automobiles. That's including all the manufacturing and all the fossil fuels that you use when you drive it, and probably lots of other things I haven't thought about. So, you know, if we had that much energy to spend on a run, what would we do? And, you know, we might have less selective pressure. We might search more broadly. We might tolerate more drift in our populations, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay, thanks for that. Wes Weimer asks, for some of the things you talk about, better search, multiple edits, coevolution, in many cases, we may not be aware of those more nuanced way to do things. And you're telling us about them now, thanks. But it may also be pragmatic, it would almost be that pragmatic concerns like long fitness evaluation times for software make them look less attractive. Are there solutions or analogs on the bio side for dealing with these costs, e.g. a first stepping stone for those on the CS side?
Well, that's a really good point. I think the thing that's hard in our field, the biggest thing that's different between what we do and what the rest of evolutionary computation does is that we start with a program that's almost working, right? It's 100% correct, roughly, except for it has one defect. And that is actually, that's what allowed our field to get going, that insight that you didn't have to do what genetic programming typically did, which is start with completely random programs, is what let us be successful. But because of that, we've ended up being very conservative in terms of how we do our searches. And so I think the cost of evaluating test suites, I don't worry about so much because I think we deserve as much computational resource as machine learning does. And B, there's a lot of sampling methods and shortcuts that you could imagine devising. But I do think the question of how to get our systems to search more broadly at the same time that we preserve the functionality that we care about, that really puts us much closer to biological evolution than to evolutionary computation. And that's one reason I think we should be thinking more broadly about biology.
Okay, this is a question that I actually wanted to ask as well, and I suppose it's quite broad, and this is from Alexandra Bergel. How do we make good on the neutral mutation? And he goes on. When I apply GI, I usually avoid doing mutations that decrease the fitness or leave it unchanged. From your talk, you said that neutrals are important, but I'm unsure how to make good use of it.
Well, okay. The relentless self-promotion answer is look at our paper in IPDPS, where we design an algorithm. It's not very, it's a multiplicative weights update algorithm rather than a true genetic algorithm, but it leverages these neutral mutations. That's one answer. The other answer, and I'm really grateful for this question because not only do we not tolerate neutral mutations, we also don't tolerate slightly deleterious mutations. And there's a thing in evolution known as compensatory evolution, where you sort of systems have sort of minor decreases in fitness that then lead to big jumps forward in the future. And so I think roughly the answer to that is less selective pressure, bigger populations, and figuring out how all that works, and taking the theory that has been developed by population biology, population geneticists, and really understanding how it applies to our systems is important work, and it's not as obvious as it should be, to me at least.
That's a good answer. I also really liked your whole thing that we should just use more computing power on these things, and that seems to be solves a lot of problems as well, or could do.
Well, it's just going to reshape what we care about, yeah. And these machine learning algorithms haven't changed in 30 years or something, really.
So Oliver asks, is software really mutually robust, or is it that these operators we use are just designed this way to avoid breaking the code, intentionally or otherwise?
Mutationally robust.
Yes.
Yes, the amount of mutational robustness certainly depends on the kind of mutation that we do. I will just point out that most of us are still using copy, delete, and some form of swap or move, but copy and delete for sure. And those mutation operators were based on edit operations that people do. But that is, I will say that's another thing that strikes me about our field is that we're still using those same basic paradigms and then just changing what gets copied, what gets deleted, what gets moved. And there might be, other possible classes of mutations that we could think about.
Thank you. We've got 90 seconds left. I think we've answered all the questions. So I'll thank you on behalf of the whole audience. Thank you very much for giving your talk today. And thank you very much for the Q&A. And I think this all went broadcast well. I didn't hear any problems, so that's fantastic. Do you have any final comments or?
Well, I first of all want to thank the audience for these great questions. I'm sorry I couldn't see the chat. So if any of you wrote other questions into the chat or comments to me directly, if you could just please send them to me by email, or I will be lurking around for most of the rest of the workshop. But I feel really blind without having the chat available, and I don't know why I didn't find it here, but I didn't. Anyway, but thank you, everybody. It was a lot of fun, and it was a lot harder for me to pull this together than I thought it was going to be.
Thank you. So I suppose just since I have the audience, we're going to take a 20-minute break now, and then it's going to be the first paper session, depending on your time zone, but it's 5:25 p.m. in UTC time. and I'll let you guys convert that for yourself. And we've got some interesting papers coming up, and I look forward to seeing you there. Different format. It's going to be the recorded talks and then Q&A. So see you soon.
Okay, thank you.